So now we got our seed data displaying on the screen. Next thing we want to do is we want to actually create this to-do form component. So we go into our components here. We have to-do form, and we're just going to wipe all this out because what we want to do is actually put in a form component. This form will have an input. So this is just HTML5 input. Type is text. On the input, we want to give it a name, and I'll show you why. We're going to call this to do. Give it a value. I'll leave this blank for now, but I will come back to that in just a minute. We'll give it a placeholder of enter your to-do item. Okay. And we'll save that. Come back and look at it here. Go to re-render. Okay, cool. We want to add a submit button. Type. This is init. I think it comes with VSCode now. So type submit, we'll just type in, we'll say add to do. Right. Okay, looking good. Okay, now what we're going to do here is we're actually going to get into some functionality in our functional React component. Now within a form, you have two processes in React that you want to control, which makes your form into a controlled component. Not to get too deep into what that means, but basically you want to control what happens within your form. You don't want the browser defaults to happen, etc. The two processes that you want to cover are changes and submissions. So what we can do is we can declare a function called handle change. Okay, and handle submit. Okay, so the change is going to go on our inputs, and the submit will go on the form itself. So this is actually on change and on submit. So these are event listeners, event listener attributes. And then what we'll do is we will comment this out for now. I'll need to save. So every time we type something, you see this ticker going out. We get change, and then we'll submit. Oh. So for submit, on a submit function, the default behavior is to reload the browser, which is kind of strange. But what we can do here is pass it a event object, and we can prevent that default behavior by saying event.prevent defaults. Okay, now let's try this again. Okay, there. So we get our submit rendering. Now the fun part. Intro to hooks. Here we go. So what we'll do is this is going to be your first hook here. So use state hook. Now before the use state hook came out, if you wanted to handle state within your component, you had to use a class component. Now that use state has come out, we can actually handle state within our functional components. The syntax is written basically, it's an assignment where you assign your variable to an array with 2 items. The first item is your getter, basically, and your second item is your setter, and then you set it equal to useState. So it looks like this. So we want to name this something that makes sense for what we're doing, so we'll say to do and set to do equals useState. And within useState, we can set a default state here, and what we want to set it as an empty string. That's not 100% necessary all the time to set a default state, but it's good practice just to keep your data types consistent. So what we can do now is when we change, let's check this out. So what we want to do is set the value here to do dot message. And actually what we want to do here is turn this into an object with message equal to an empty string. Okay. Here we'll pass an event through as well. What we want to do is set the to do to the event.target. Oh, actually, since we're using an object now, message is event.target.value. And we can console.log to do. So the idea being here, this is going to set this message string to whatever is entered here in the input and set it as this variable here. So we can console log this to do here and keep up with what we're doing as we go. Can't spell, but there you go. Last thing we'll do real quick here, so we can see what our data looks like when we're actually submitting, is we'll console log the to do here. Let's take this out. This is a to do, we'll submit. And you'll see this message is actually stored in state within this component's state. So now that we're controlling our data that's being passed through our input and we are keeping up with that in our component state, so now let's actually do something with that data, with that input. Instead of just console logging it, let's actually save it and do something useful with it on the screen. In this case, what we want to do is we're actually creating a to-do list. So we want to be able to add to the list. We want to be eventually able to remove things from the list. We want to be able to edit an item in the list. So let's think about this for a second. Right now, we have this to-do list, and all the to-do list is doing is mapping over these to-dos. Okay? The only problem here is the data being placed here within this file, it now is only easily accessible by this component, and then we could possibly send it down to this component, which is what we're doing actually. But a really good idea, really good practice, is actually bump that up to a higher level. The idea being, we can take this, our data that's being used here, let's bump it up to a higher level to this parent component, and now our to-do form and to-do list can both have access to this.
This is due to React's unidirectional data flow. So the idea is you put that data at the top level and then pass it down through props to its children. So we'll do this. Probably get some warnings, but that's okay, we're not done yet. Here we're getting error because to-dos is not defined. So what we want to do is actually pass these down through props. So on our to-do list, let's say our to-dos is equal to, our to-dos prop is equal to our to-dos variable. Remember this, we could name this anything, XYZ, and we would just have to say XYZ. Okay? It would actually be props.xyz. Okay, and this would work. But this isn't very helpful to us because we want to know what it is. You're not just developing for a computer, you're developing for other developers. So you want them to know what you're doing. And you want to remember what you're doing also. Okay. So we can do this just like this, and if we go back to our screen here, our browser, then we'll see it's still working. A quick little way to make this a little bit cleaner. If you're only using one or two, maybe three props, it's usually a good idea, and it makes your components a lot cleaner, is to just destructure it. So instead of defining props here, an entire props object, let's destructure the to-dos out of it. Then we can get rid of this, and it works the same way. If I had more than one prop I was passing, I could do it this way, but we're only concerned with to-dos in this component right now. So go back, still working, all good. So now we'll go back to our index file, and remember how here in to-do form we're using this use state. Okay, and this is to set the individual to-do based on whatever the user enters here. We're going to use this same method, the same use state, to actually handle the state in this component as well. So now we're actually handling two different states in two different components. The one state being what's entered into the form, what's being held and submitted through the form. And here we have the state of, we're going to be modifying this to-dos array based on what gets entered here and submitted here. So what we can do here now is to define our, this is going to be what we're going to consider our app state. This is our application state. So this is not at an individual level like the input, where it's just handling that individual component's input, whatever's put in there from the user. This is application state, so this is data that is going to be used and manipulated by multiple components throughout the application. So what we can do here is set the to-dos. We can call this whatever we want, to-dos, to-do list. And then we'll have our setter here, so set to-dos equals use state. We'll set an initial state here, and we want it to be this to-dos list that we've already defined here. And actually we're getting a naming conflict here because we're trying to redefine to-dos. So let's actually just call this to-do list. Set to-do list. Okay, and then we'll set the initial state to this array. So the next thing that we want to do is actually update this to to-do list. So this is variable, it's not this static array. Now it's whatever we change it to. Okay, now let's think about this for a second. Our to-do list is only really concerned about mapping over the to-do list. So it doesn't care about manipulating it. It's only trying to read that data. But our to-do form is trying to manipulate that data by adding to it. We'll get to the point where we're deleting and editing that data. So what we can now do here is actually say set to-dos is equal to set to-do list. So you see here, not only are we able to pass through arrays, objects, strings, but we can also pass through functions. So we save that and we'll go over to our to-do form, okay? And then we can destructure here again, set to-dos. We call it set to-dos or set to-dos. Okay, and that's good because now we don't have this naming conflict. I know this is kind of confusing, but naming things is one of the most difficult things when it comes to programming, is naming your variables in a way that makes sense and in a way that's just not confusing in general. So it's always a topic of consideration to really think about what you're naming things, and are you being specific enough, that kind of thing. Now here comes the fun part where it all starts to connect. So here, instead of console logging, what we want to do is actually use this function here that we're passing down, and we actually want to set those to-dos at the application level. Here is the tricky part. We don't want to overwrite what's in the to-dos. We just want to add to it, right? So this actually brings up another point where we need to also pass down those to-dos. So we'll do that. Now we have access to that. Okay. Now again, we're not trying to overwrite, but we're trying to add to it. So we can actually use array destructuring. We can use, this is called the spread operator. Okay. And then to do. So what this does is this spreads in everything that exists in that to-dos array already, and then adds the to-do that we've saved into state onto it. So what we can do to monitor what's going on here is we can, the old trusty console log, console.log to-dos. Alright, so I totally goofed. Of course this is not going to update because we're just logging this every single time. What we really want to log is to-do list, right? Because that's the one that's being manipulated. And y'all are probably screaming at me through your computers right now, but we really want to log the to-do list. That's the one that's being updated. Okay, this is not. This is only our initial state. And in fact, it might help us to actually label it that. Okay. And of course, there's another, I did it again here. Wow. You guys are probably screaming at me right now. Okay. Now let's close this out. Work this time. There we go. So now we don't have an ID on it, so let's add that. Okay. Our setter. Let's just use 4 for now. 5, something like that. Whenever we hook up our backend, this will actually be done by the database itself. This will increment, so we don't have to worry about this. But you know what? Actually, let's do this. So this actually date.now will give you the number of seconds that have passed since, I think it's January 1st, 1970. So you get this crazy like number string, but it's going to be completely unique. So let's go with that, because we really need to put this here. Let's just set this back to empty string. All right. Take what, 6? Okay. There we go.
All right, so we just got our form working. We've got it updating our application state. We're passing state around, or we're passing data around through props. We're passing functions. The next thing that we want to do is we actually want to add all of the CRUD functionality to our to-do list. And so CRUD meaning create, read, update, delete. So I'll see you in the next video where we complete those CRUD functions. We got create, we got read. Now next we'll do update and delete. I'll see you there.